All right. Hey, everybody. How's it going? Good Friday evening. I'm back with part two for all the people who made part one of the reading. The choice, Samuel Yette, and I am back. We stopped on page 52. The last time I was reading, we're still in chapter two. Chapter two is actually a really long chapter. But anyway, I got a couple of inbox messages from people like, when you going live again to finish reading? So anyway, y'all make sure y'all like the video, make sure you share it and invite people in. A little bit of background about this book. It is a book that is no longer in print. Nevertheless, it is a book that is extremely important. And this book is relevant today because of a lot of things that is, transpiring or will be, transpiring, with a lot of the things economically in terms of the choice, the issue of Black survival. And he actually gives a pretext in this book, originally written in 1971 and has been published 5 times since then. The original contents from 1971 is still in all of the other the 4 that came after, plus new information. I believe this copy is from 1985. You can hardly find these. If you go on Amazon, it's $700, which is why I'm doing a reading of this book to get the information out to the people. And if you didn't get a chance to listen to the first one, Samuel Yette is an ancestor now, but he was the first African-American Washington Bureau reporter, not a broadcast reporter, but writer for the Newsweek magazine or Newsweek. And they fired him as a result of writing this book and warning his community out of deep love of, some of the behind the scenes things that he had found out through his journalism, investigative journalism, through the government, nonprofit and NGOs, and all of the things in between. So that's why this book is so critically important. That's why I think it's important for us to, have some conversations about it and make sure that we are letting our people know about what's going on. So here we go. We're still in chapter 2 on page 52. So you can always go back to the first part 1 of this to get the foreword and also get the information from before where we are now, 52. So starting at the beginning of page 52, don't forget to like and share the video and invite others to come on in to listen to part 2, which is going to be another partial reading because this book is very thick, as you can see. All right, page 52. Obvious also is the fact that the willingness of the government to pick up the tabs for experimental equipment, albeit with money earmarked for the poor, is the break industry had in mind from the outset. A routine travesty committed by the Office of Employment Opportunity in 1966 shows clearly how the agency substituted the interest of the rich for those of the poor. On the first day of the fiscal year, July 1st, 1966, the Office of Employment Opportunity announced a $1.17 million contract for an array of computer gadgetry. On the first day of the new fiscal year, July 1st, about 44% of the money, $443,750,000, went to the Board of Education of the City of New York, with the remainder, $666,000, used to purchase 20 talking typewriters, formerly called the Edison Responsive Environment. The point of the deal, according to the OEO release, was to help New York's culturally deprived children and adults learn to read quickly. The revolutionary talking computers will also be used to teach reading skills to school dropouts and functionally illiterate adults during afternoon and evening classes. The OEO had earlier completed a similar deal, providing the same machines for the Chicago Welfare Department. The cost, $600,000. Beginning in about 1964, the military industrial educationalists were obviously on a binge of producing gadgets at high cost, experimenting with the unwitting poor while raking off the money ostensibly aimed at the poor. As the OEA had the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, the Office of Education had the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or the ESEA. That law is still in effect today, by the way. It's called the Every Student Succeeds Act, just so you all know. Okay. But like the OEO, the Office of Education was a sitting duck for educational gadgeteers, producers mainly of audiovisual aids, small computers, which virtually no teachers knew how to use, even if they had the time, and an undigestible assortment of so-called institutional materials. Thanks to the ESEA, millions passed through the slightly numb hands of state and local school administrators and into the coffers of the gadgeteers. How fast the businessmen move, evident of the Office of Education budget outlays for their wares. In fiscal year 1965, the year before the ESEA was effective, the total Office of Education budget was $954,717,000, with $115,150,000 of it spent with the industrialists. However, fiscal year 1966 was a bumper year for the industrialists, who raked off profits from the poor in both job courts and the Office of Education. In fiscal year 1966, the Office of Education doubled its total budget to $1,972,000,000,000. Oh my God. But its spending with the industrialists quadrupled from $115,100,000 to $522,130,000. A crucial point, however, is the fact that although the Office of Education total budget doubled again in fiscal year 1966 from $1.9 billion to $3.8 billion, its spending with industrialists actually dropped from $522 million to $442 million. Eventually, a reckoning of some kind was inevitable, but forced more by the industrial dilemma than by any enlightened recognition of the poor's needs by the government and the industrialists. The school warehouses were simply filled to the gills, finally alerting state and local school administrators that their common judgment would have to prevail if indeed the federal bureaucrats and the corporate gadgeteers were to be halted. Despite the fact that the industrialists managed a slight new spurt in spending in the Office of Education fiscal year 68 budget, $465 million from swollen total budget to $3.9 billion, the budget events of fiscal year 69 removed all doubt that the downturn was solid. The $6 billion Johnson administration cut demanded by the Congress had a sobering effect, of course, but considering the increase given the Office of Education's total budget in 1969 of $4.1 billion, the industrialist share of only $351 million was clearly bad news. The change had been evident at least a year earlier in the education program industry had run for the Office of Educational Economic Opportunity. Under pressure from such tireless critics as Congresswoman Edith Green, a Democrat of Oregon, of the House Education Labor Committee and Jobs Corps, began cutting back on costs by closing Job Corps centers in the last quarter of fiscal year 1968. Despite hurried objections from the business community and protests from even liberal lawmakers such as Senator Wayne Morse, Democrat of Oregon, whose victorious opponent, Republican Robert W. Packwood, twitted him during the 1968 campaign for not being able to keep business pouring into the state. I'm sorry, I lost. Yeah, the OEO had to close 4 centers, knocking 3 firms out of the circle. Rodman Center in New Bedford, Massachusetts was closed, ending a lucrative scheme of IBM. Termination of the Lincoln Center in Lincoln, Nebraska, knocked out the Northern National Gas. The closing of the Custer Center in Battle Creek, Michigan, eliminated U.S. Industries Incorporated. And although RCA lost the McCoy Center in Sparta, Wisconsin, it stayed in the Job Corps business with the Keystone Center in Pennsylvania. Although the Job Corps cutbacks order was not effective until March of 1968, the order was handed down in January, early enough to reduce the Job Corps educational expenditures more than $1 million, from $105,522,000 in fiscal year 67 to $104 million in fiscal year 68. Even deeper cuts were effective in fiscal year 69, reassuring the industrialists that they were right to be concerned at the first evidence of fairness insanity 2 years earlier. It was this concern that brought Education Commissioner Harold Howe II before the annual convention of the National Audiovisual Association at Washington Sheraton Park Hotel on July 13, 1968. It was a watermark in the public relationships between the education establishment and the corporate gadgeteers. Howe was immersed in pressures both from superintendents in need of warehouse space and from businessmen who reminded him that President Johnson's chief emissaries had urged the private sector to enter the Great Society ahead of the poor a few years earlier. Howe told the association, quote, "Some of our social critics have become increasingly concerned over what seems to them the ominous emergence of a new social industrial complex rivaling in its inequity and influence the military industrial complex, against which President Eisenhower warned us nearly a decade ago. About the only similarity I see between education and defense industries is that both developed well-oiled routes to Congress, a development to be expected by any except the politically naive. I would urge you not to confine your concerns simply to the making and selling of educational hard goods or even educational systems. I do not assume that your interests and those of education are exactly identical, but neither do I assume that they are inherently incompatible. I see no reason why the new educational technology cannot prove immensely profitable by both the students of America and for the stockholders of educational industry. There are those who fear that the education industry will exert an undue influence upon American education and usurp decision-making functions that ought to be reserved to educators and to society and citizenry as a whole. I do not discount this danger, but I do not think it is the only problem of the most immediate," end quote. Any modicum of candor required Howe to face up to the industrial dilemma brought on by the profits from the poor schemes, he did. It must be said, quote, "It must be said that the reluctance of some educators to talk to business is not necessarily the result of any excessively puritanical attitude towards profits, for industry has not always served American education well. I could cite, for example, the hard-selling spree of a few years ago," end quote. The spree was the result of new relationship between business and education, and it necessitated some readjustment. Dr. George Redfern, Associate Secretary of the 18,000 member of the American Association of School Administration, stated later in an interview, as industry and business moved into the development of hardware and software to incorporate the new technology in education, Dr. Redfern explained, there has been a new kind of a relationship between business and education. That's interesting, a new kind of relationship between business and education. Dr. Redfern explained, there has been a new kind of relationship between business and education. Corporations such as General Learning have been formed. Business and industry now say we're going into education not only to perform a service, but to sell a service. This seems to be more activist kind of relationship, whereas before it was an adversary kind of relationship, end quote. Educator Redfern spoke charitably of the pressure selling tactics that victimize school administrators, loading them with useless hardware. Quote, some of these ventures business has undertaken have not worked out, and some administrators have been disappointed. We thought the industrialists could provide more than time has proved that they can. Certain experiments looked very promising, but they are still in the experimental stage. Such devices as the talking typewriter have not become the miracle that can solve all education problems. But we should not condemn industry. There was an unrealistic expectation on the part of some of us school people, end quote. Dr. Redfern was quite specific, however, in pointing to the emergency produced by education industrial dilemma, quote, in the beginning of the federal programs, we bought more machinery than we needed and got overstocked on that. And they were not wisely used. I think that is great danger if you get federal money, you are tempted to overbuy. But when 30,000 school administrators come to our conventions, as they did in Atlantic City, and look at this new equipment brought there by 7 or 8 firms, they have become more hesitant to buy. And this is good for business and industry as well as administrators. So we are having some readjusting in the market, close quote. A knowledgeable official in the Office of Education stated flatly that this readjusting means that, quote, some of the smaller guys, retailers, are overstocked and they're having to go into the warehousing business because of the fluctuation might put them out of business, end quote. Quote, you see, the Office of Education official continued, when this money first became available, a lot of little guys figured that this was a good deal and they'd be better to get in on it in a hurry. They did. But then a year later, the holes were filled up. It's all even now. Naturally, this fluctuation will hit the little guy harder than the big guys. But the outlook is for the big producers, those well enough diversified to weather the low-key revolt of a school administrators. If, as the need increases for the industrialists to substitute domestic gadgets for those no longer shipped to the Southeast Asia, the hardware spree of anti-poverty's vintage years will be on again. The pressures will mount once more on the school hierarchy, and the administrators will fight back, realizing that their own hollow policy and decision-making roles are challenged by an array of talking machines. One of the best informed and strategically located men in this arena thinks the industrialists and their machines have already won the battle. Thanks to federal anti-poverty financing, this key man is Dr. Robert C. Snyder, Assistant Director of the National Education Association's Division of Educational Technology, and more importantly, a special consultant to the Commission on Instructional Technology, or CIT. The CIT was created pursuant to provisions in Title III of the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967. Its job is to look broadly into what former Education Commissioner Howe termed, quote, the instructional technology, including television, radio, the computer, films, and recording both in their relation to each other and to instruction, end quote. Dr. Snyder, whose views are given urgent consideration by the Commission, thinks that it is too late to worry whether industry is going to influence educational policy, that it is time rather to consider the content of the influence. The classroom teacher becomes more and more dependent on an array of materials, movies, slides, and the like produced by a private industry. Dr. Snyder said, without a hint of unhappiness, the more schools buy, the more things bought will influence instruction and eventually school policy. The handwriting is on the wall. There is a danger here that American schools will be taught by General Motors and General Foods. but we must admit that the classroom teaching, standing before the classroom talking, is a very primitive form of communication. The new knowledge is going to force recognition of the schools. Several years later, President Johnson declared his unconditional war on poverty. The Wall Street corporations were counting higher profits and discounting the changes that offer shares to the poor. The poor, meanwhile, were no less institutionalized in their poverty. The meaning of the episode we put correctly and in cruel innocence by Shriver's successor, acting director Bertrand Harding, speaking on OEO's 4th anniversary. Perhaps the most powerful institution OEO has effected is that of the business model. When the war on poverty began, among our loudest critics were the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Association of Manufacturers, and countless private corporations. They saw it as another tax-consuming welfare-style program, one that the Democrats brag about and the Republicans pay for. Worse, they saw it as an attack on free enterprise and self-reliance. But then something happened. Last year, when it looked doubtful that the Economic Opportunity Act would get through Congress, some of our strongest defenders turned out to the Chamber of Commerce. The NAM, people like Tex Thornton of Litton Thomas Watson of IBM, and Henry Ford. The reason for this turnout was clear. The business world took a closer look at the war on poverty. They saw it was basically a conservative in outlook. It was relatively inexpensive. It was run locally, and programs were based on self-reliance, a virtue long espoused by this segment of American society. Most of all, the business world saw that it was on its own economic interest to end poverty in America. The economic phase of the Black Poor Pacification Program was clearly a victory for the military industrialists. Just as clearly, it was an economic setback for the Black poor, who still had hopes of social gains to offset the relative economic losses. The opportunities outlined in the new Great Society pacification rhetoric were inviting, if not compelling. But alongside that rhetoric were seeds for the full-blown, cleverly woven police web that was also encircling the Black poor. Some confusion was inevitable. On the one hand was the warning of a veteran radical, Bayard Rustin. On the other hand were glowing promises from such proven liberals as Hubert H. Humphrey, the nation's number 2 citizen. Paradoxically, both the warning and the promise had been made possible by the paper milestones of 1964, along with the elections that followed, but laws, being only tools, were to be used by bureaucratic machines, the system, a long pattern set by ultimate political pressures. The bureaucrats and politicians could build either fortresses of hope and justice or camps to contain those mangled and aggrieved by injustice and hopelessness. Bayard Rustin, the backstage organizer of last summer's March on Washington, is calling upon Negroes to enlist the support of poor whites in a social revolution, reported syndicated columnist Jack Anderson in the Washington Post, November 15, 1964. As part of his pitch, Rustin has set up a cry against President Johnson's anti-poverty czar, Sergeant Shriver. Shriver is immoral, said Rustin, when he claims he can give our youth vocational training in his work camps. All he wants to do is get our boys off the street. We must not allow our sons to be picked up and hauled off to remote concentration camps, end quote. That, of course, was a pointed warning of how civil rights and anti-poverty laws could, at the mercy of bad bureaucrats and power-sick politicians, be used in totally negative ways. Thus, personnel and the whims of the bureaucracy itself became crucial. While Shriver obviously had his personal credibility problems with the Negroes, President Johnson was saying things most Negroes wanted to hear, and two, simultaneously, essentially bureaucratic moves made his most cynical Negro critics take notice. Without question, President Johnson, the veteran of every level and shade of the bureaucracy, understood the bureaucracy. He knew the game could be won or lost there. Two movers early in 1965 were designed to win. First, shortly after the election, Johnson announced that the new president, longtime civil rights advocate Hubert H. Humphrey, would have an overall role to play in the war on poverty, a move welcomed by the sparkling of liberal bureaucracy in the federal system. They felt that Shriver's title of director scarcely equipped him to coordinate the anti-poverty programs, reclaimant department heads, and carried cabinet level rank and status. The move also improved OEO's credibility among some Negroes who had not learned to trust Shriver. As a junior senator from Minnesota in 1948, Humphrey sparked a Dixiecrat walkout of the Democratic National Convention because of his insistence on strong civil rights plank. Just as gallantly, he went about his new job as federal civil rights overseer assigned to him by President Johnson. Humphrey began calling on each agency and department head in the federal establishment and explaining that he fully intended to carry out the president's assignment in getting the Civil Rights Act of 1964 implemented. Humphrey said with astonishing directness, "Now, Sarge, there's no use in our fiddling around on this matter. Let's get right down to it," end quote. The vice president went on to tell Shriver that the Office of Economic Opportunity had a special mission in the civil rights struggle, for the anti-poverty program could put flesh on the bones of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. In that meeting, the vice president represented personally what the OEO symbolized in theory. But down the bureaucratic line, the wheels were already turning in the opposite direction. Veteran bureaucrats who knew the potential of the law and a tough backer like Humphrey were already busy moving the wrong man into the right places and the right man into the wrong places, proven bureaucratic techniques. Specifically, the Office of Economic Opportunity official in charge of personnel and the management drafted an appointment order for Shriver, which when Shriver signed it, made the OEO's chief civil rights officer a low-grade management employee who could handle civil rights, along with his other chores and in his spare time. The announcement was spotted by Lissel Carter, the only Negro on the senior staff at the time. Carter, who had been in the Civil Rights Enforcement Officer at HEW prior to coming to the Office of Employment Opportunity as Interagency Relations Director, sent a stiff memorandum to Shriver complaining that the job at the OEO was too important to be handled in the manner Shriver intended. A few days later, Shriver asked me to take the job. It wasn't long before I realized that some careful wording in the announcement of my appointment was neither incidental nor to be taken lightly. It had made me the chief civil rights officer, but carefully provided that enforcement of non-discrimination in contracts awarded to OEO would be the responsibility of OEO's deputy director, Jack Conway. Conway is a high union official with the United Auto Workers, warmly assured me that he would permit me to assist him in the contract work whenever my help was needed. But he would call me. He never did, not once. In time, though, it was clear this interest was very much a union interest. Non-discrimination was fine so long as it did not interfere with unionism. That is, sacrosanct seniority rules that automatically exclude non-whites, legislative policies that lended neither to lower union wages nor to put poor job trainees in competition with the unionists. The various other union hall concerns, all of which meant that I would never review on OEA's contract and the contract would never be stopped for civil rights reasons. Among the most difficult aspects of enforcement of civil rights laws were obstinate bureaucrats such as the OEA General Counsel, Donald Baker, who were able to stand in the way of enforcement beyond them. However, was a fact of paramount importance in enforcement strategy. The lines of authority, responsibility, and budget were so studiously chaotic and diffuse that any coordinated attack or any tangible phase of racism under government was difficult at best. This deliberate bureaucracy hocus pocus involved a diffusion of civil rights responsibility and confusion of authority that extended across agency lines, indeed across three branches as well as three levels of government. But President Johnson, an accomplished student of the bureaucracy, understood all of this when he put a super bureaucrat, the vice president, at the top of the system to streamline authority. His second move, however, was by far the most significant civil rights move of the pacification era. It offered the only hope of bringing federal programs to bear on problems of the Black poor by counteracting scheming congressional cliques and their carefully placed civil servants. Essentially, the game they play involves keeping the bureaucratic machinery slightly tilted so that in efforts to solve certain problems, all the necessary ingredients are never present at any one time or place. Or to put it another way, it is much like the shell game of con men. The bean is theoretically under one of three shells. You guess which one of those con artists works his sleight of hand. The basic move is keeping the three required ingredients to any solution: authority, responsibility, funds, and or personnel. In a delicate suspension. One agency, for example, is given responsibility for a particular job, while another has authority but not the responsibility, while still another has either the funds or the staff, and the never three shall meet. This was precisely the game being played on the homeless Black Mississippians who in early 1966 came to Washington for help after days of circling the bureaucratic bases, resorted to sleeping on the ground among the mums of wet and cold Lafayette Park while many bureaucrats looked on in amusement. Perhaps more than any other single fact, President Johnson's establishment of a Council on Economic Opportunity indicated a sincere attempt at genuine change, not mere vested interest pacification. That Johnson move in February 1965 aligned federal agencies in a way that assured coordination by a single individual directly responsible to him, Vice President Humphrey. President Johnson was, as it were, removing two of the con man's three shells. There would be only one shell to watch, and the bean there should be there. This bold anti-bureaucratic move began to take shape when Vice President Humphrey wrote the president on January 4th, 1965, quote, "I and members of my staff have also met with or solicited views from the representatives of state and local governments and of many private organizations. These included governors, mayors, city managers, police chiefs, civil rights leaders, and the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, officials of human relations bodies, labor organizations, businesses, educational institutions, and major religious bodies. On the basis of information developed from these consultations and other studies, and from the extensive written material which has been submitted, I have concluded that there is a need for establishment by executive order of a Presidential Council on Equal Opportunity, composed of the highest level representatives of those departments and agencies most directly involved in the civil rights field and chartered by the Vice President. Vice President Humphrey's report," that's end quote. Vice President Humphrey's report underscored the new federal intent to use its massive spending power via contracts to eliminate job discrimination. This new anti-bureaucratic approach by the president would either begin to improve conditions of the Black poor, or it would soon have to be a target of the strongest reactionary forces. It became a target. During the spring of congressional recess in 1965, rumors seeped back to Washington about powerful Southern congressmen meeting secretly in their home states and designing ways to sabotage what was beginning to look like nonviolent revolution in America. The President's Council on Equal Opportunity was headed by the daring but very brief existence. The first meeting on March 3rd got right down to business. Heads of all contracting agencies, civil rights agencies, and the Attorney General, Nicholas Katzenbach, were all brought together in one room in the Indian Treaty Room under the aegis of the Vice President, who had enough administrative clout to pinpoint problems and other solutions by men who were directly in control of them. Task forces were assigned in the major social areas, education, labor, and community relations, for example. By the time of the second meeting on May 19th, the council, under daily orders from the vice president, had begun to mobilize to hit where it hurt in the financial statements of private industry and those of state and local government. Computers were being organized to ferret out civil rights violators, much as they ferret out tax dodgers, and to indicate where withholding federal money would be possible and most effective. For example, that second meeting heard a report on Alabama by William L. Taylor, staff director of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The report was typically a dismal survey of the plight of Black people in the South, same as today, right? But there was singular significance to the report coming as it did before the council. The focus of the council was on concerted effort by 12 federal agencies represented, the result being the state of Alabama would be forced to change many racist policies or lose $1 billion in federal income. The council was no paper tiger, thus it had to go. But while the fact was axiomatic from the outset, two specific events sealed its doom. The council's involvement in two cases drew together of two of the most encrusted, resourceful, and determined exploiters of the Black poor, big city bosses, and Southern governors. The two events were, number one, the council's endorsement of federal intervention on behalf of Dr. King's Selma to Montgomery March on March 20th, and two, an aborted cutoff of funds to the de facto segregated schools of Mayor Richard J. Daley's Chicago on September 29th, 1965. Actually, arch segregationists themselves could not have chosen better tactical strategy than to draw together Mayor Daley and Alabama Governor George Wallace. The first catalytic involvement of the council emerged suddenly, and within 2 weeks after the council's first meeting. In the organization meeting, Vice President Humphrey had stated that the president from time to time would ask the advice of the council on a major policy decision involving civil rights. In January, Dr. King announced a new voter registration drive in Selma, Alabama. That's where I grew up, by the way. A city with a history of violent suppression of Negroes' right to vote. Incident followed incident until on Sunday afternoon, March 7th, some 500 Black protest marchers were attacked by 200 Alabama state troopers and sheriff's deputy, many of them on horseback, who spewed tear gas, then mercilessly clubbed their victims, including large numbers of women and children. So at the end of this paragraph, that is the march that John Lewis was involved in, that everybody knows about, and it's called Bloody Sunday. That's what he's referring to in this book here. Writing his column in the Amsterdam News, March 20th, 1965, NAACP Executive Secretary Roy Wilkins commented, and I quote, "They don't want just to keep registration and equality, they want blood. The diehard Southern white element of many of those who hold office at its hands want blood. They got it last week and the week before in Alabama. They got James Jackson's blood during a march in Marion, Alabama. They got it on Selma Sunday, March 7th, when they cracked heads, broke legs, and curled bullwhips around bodies in a vicious, hateful, shocking attack by fully armed state troopers against unarmed, singing, and praying men, women, and children. That's some devils that'll do something like that. Sick. Wilkins Urban League counterpart Whitney Young Jr., writing in the same edition of the Amsterdam News, called for the use of federal troops to protect the marchers, who were there to demonstrate for the right to vote. The people and the soil of Alabama, he said, ought to be as precious to us as the people in the soil of Vietnam, where we have only in the past week dispatched 3,500 Marines to prevent aggression. But sending federal soldiers into Alabama would be no simple chore. For one thing, Alabama's Governor George Wallace had, after a fashion, kept his threat to stand in the schoolhouse door a short time earlier to bar Negro children from entering all white school classrooms. Avoiding an impasse with Wallace was much more attractive than winning one. Two, the troops and other commitments for then quiet adventure in Vietnam were assured only through the favor of such as Georgia Senator Richard Russell, chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, South Carolina Congressman Mendel L. Rivers, chairman of the House Military Preparedness Committee, and Mississippi Senator James Stennis, a ranking member of both the Senate Appropriations Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. All of these men represented states that are neighbors to Alabama, both geographically and in majority sentiment. With just the right rationale, then the president would avoid a confrontation with George Wallace. It was such a note that the White House called a special meeting on the council Friday, March 12, 1965. The atmosphere in the Indian Treaty Room was tense and cautious. At the outset, the vice president distinctly emphasized that the representatives were summoned on specific orders of President Johnson. With great care, he also emphasized that the president would hold each man personally accountable for whatever views each expressed. He stationed David Filver, secretary of the council, prominently at his left and warned that each man's name would be written beside its remarks and submitted to the president. Another massive march was being planned by Dr. King. The question put before the council: what, if anything, should the president do in the view of threatened massacre of thousands of Black peaceful marchers? There were a few weak statements, such as Civil Service Commission Director John Macy suggesting that the president should limit federal involvement to an expression of moral concern. But there were also strong statements by such men as the Black FHA Administrator Robert C. Weaver, Labor Secretary Wirtz, and numerous second echelon officials engaged primarily in civil rights enforcement. Representing Shriver at the meeting, the OEA Assistant Secretary Lissel C. Carter Jr. expressed the sentiment of the council. Quote, "The federal government has no real choice but to provide support for Dr. King's movement," end quote. That became the council's recommendation to the president. 8 days later, on March 20th, President Johnson signed a proclamation citing the danger of domestic violence and took other actions federalizing the Alabama National Guard and authorizing use of whatever federal troops the defense secretary may deem necessary in the situation. The president said he ordered 1,863 federalized guardsmen to the area, 500 regular Army military policemen to Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, and 509 more MPs to Craig Field near Selma, 100 FBI agents and 75 to 100 U.S. Marshals. 1,000 regular infantry troops had been alerted at Fort Benning, Georgia. In taking the action, President Johnson said, quote, "It is not a welcome duty for the federal government to ever assume a state government's own responsibility for assuring the protections of citizens in the exercise of their constitutional rights." It has been rare in our history for the governor and the legislature of a sovereign state to decline to exercise their responsibility and to request that duty be assumed by the federal government. I have responded both to their request and to what I believe is sure and certain duty of the federal government in the protection of constitutional rights of all American citizens. I'm sorry, y'all, I just got emotional thinking about that. Thinking about them having to send in troops to protect Black people from white supremacists. It's crazy. The strong recommendation of the Council for Alabama Troop Action could not have endeared it to the segregationist elements on Capitol Hill. But whatever was lacking in North-South anti-civil rights coalition was abundantly supplied a few months later when Education Commissioner Francis Keppel took a sudden swing at de facto school segregation up north. This was the second catalytic event that forged the coalition of Deep South congressmen and governors with big northern city mayors. If as Roy Wilkins said, Southern governors wanted blood, Northern mayors wanted no less than to be left alone. In an unusual and startling action, Keppel and the Office of Education announced that $90 million in federal education funds would be withheld from Chicago School Board for de facto segregation practices already documented in separate reports by sociologists Dr. Philip M. Hauser and Dr. Robert J. Hagevitz. While there were some minor questions about meeting the technical requirements for cutting off funds, Keppel's announced action was taken under the enforcement provisions of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Although Title VI provides the cutting off of federal aid, Keppel's actions was political dynamite. The White House resoundingly reversed Keppel and ordered the school funds be promptly delivered to Chicago without any relationship to de facto segregation or the lack thereof. The Keppel reversal was a shocking psychological blow to the Federal Civil Rights Commission. And there was no logic to explain either why Keppel so completely ignored political strategies by picking on Chicago's Mayor Daley first, or why by picking the Chicago Mayor Daley first, or why the preparation of his case against Chicago was in the minds of many civil rights lawyers so ill prepared that it invited failure under the weight of the most meager technical challenges. That Keppel had consciously raked up a straw man for Daley, and the segregationists seems most unlikely yet suspicious were never satisfactorily laid to rest among some of the government's strongest civil rights advocates. But most significant of all was the prompt demise of the PCEO, almost certainly a direct result of Keppel's challenge to Daley. A few days later, one morning in October, the word came quite unceremoniously from Figueroa that the president had rescinded the executive order and the grand coordinated federal attack on federally financed racism was no more. Its brief life of only 8 months ended in record time for federal executive orders. This sad sudden death of the PCEO was a hurried retreat from a brief coordinated attack on federal financed racism. But more than that, it's significant a resurgence of an entrenched federal and local establishments briefly threatened by federally financed, federally directed move towards pacification, if not liberation. The bosses of the system would not be content with their more victory of halting the brief federal stand for civil rights. They would demand a reversal even of the basic pacification thrust. The federal establishment itself would have to be harnessed for a fast ride in the wrong direction. The crash resulting from Keppel's ill-prepared attack on Mayor Daley and the Chicago school system was only one kind of reaction, swift and direct. The Democratic kingpin simply got on the phone to Washington and the show was over. But other big city establishments fought in subtler ways that belied the simple fact of struggle between the establishment and the increasingly rebellious Black poor. Los Angeles, under Mayor Sam Yorty, provides a graphic case in point. The tactic was simply one of ignoring federal efforts to fund the city's Black poor through newly formed community action agencies. This was most effectively done by Yorty's forcing the community action funds to pass City Hall first, and then that as far as it got. Yorty's tactic was detected by Congressman Augustus Hawkins, a Negro whose district includes the South Los Angeles Watts section. A member of then Congressman Powell's Education and Labor Committee, Hawkins appealed to Shriver to break the City Hall logjam that kept money sent to Los Angeles from reaching the target areas. The stakes were high indeed, for had Hawkins succeeded, he might well have at least delayed or minimized the destructive Watts Rebellion, which occurred in August of 1965. What Mayor Yorty was doing, in effect, was standing in the ghetto door to block money from entering the Los Angeles ghettos, just as Governor Wallace more publicly stood in the schoolhouse door to block the entrance of Black children who legally sought to attend desegregated schools in Alabama. For several months, Congressman Hawkins had tried unsuccessfully to confer personally with Shriver on Yorty's blocking of federal funds. In late April 1965, Hawkins finally managed to send a message to Shriver by an OEO aide who met with Hawkins in San Francisco. Take a look at the Los Angeles situation, Hawkins pleaded to Shriver. Shriver sent back word that he would study the situation. Meanwhile, nothing was being done to keep Mayor Yorty from intercepting and placing in escrow OEO funds that were sent to Los Angeles for the poor. The mayor's argument was that an all-white 5-member group of the Youth Opportunity Board was sufficiently large to receive and disperse the funds. The OEO regulations, however, called for the handling by a more broadly representative group, a requirement of the Economic Opportunity Act, which created the Office of Economic Opportunity. Spring rocked into summer. By late summer, although more money, some $17 million, to fight poverty and deprivation had been sent to Los Angeles than to any other city, Hawkins' complaint was unresolved. Thus, in August, as South Los Angeles Watts seethed and burned from its legacy of neglect, the federal state city bureaucracy limped along at the mercy of political business as usual. On July 7th, just 2 weeks before the Watts explosion, Vice President Humphrey gave strategic reassurance to the fretful mayors in an address in Detroit to the League of Cities convention. Quote, "City government must play a key role in the community action program," Humphrey told the mayors. "That role is assured," end quote. The mayors had to be pleased when Humphrey specifically told them that poverty money would continue to come through City Hall-dominated umbrella groups, which would be designated the official community action agencies. The great bulk of all the community action funds are being routed through community action agencies, said the vice president. And in the future, this will be even more so as communities get organized and learn to take advantage of the priorities in the law extending to such agencies. The direction of federal weight has shifted. In retrospect, the vaunted war on poverty had just surrendered to entrenched political powers after the briefest skirmish. Vice President Humphrey's strong reassurance to the mayors, coming from the man President Johnson had personally designated to put a firmer hand on the problems of the OEO, was confirmation of the surrender. I have had numerous discussions with the mayors of America and with officials of the poverty program, he told the convention. And I can tell you that your important role is as sure as it should be. But on August 18th, a week after the day of the Watts Rebellion erupted, Shriver, beset by public demands to answer why the OEO had not reached Watts, issued a statement which sought to minimize any friction between him and Yorty and to explain what OEO had done in his skirmish with the big city politicians. Begin quote, I have no fight or feud with Mayor Yorty. We have not used any strong arm tactics against him or against anyone else. Our job is to help poor people out of poverty. That's what we have been doing for 10 months, and we have been helping communities everywhere to create and manage their own local campaigns against poverty. 523 cities, towns, and counties have already organized effective local anti-poverty programs. Los Angeles, unfortunately, is the only major city in the United States which has failed to do this. Unfortunately, a few local officials in Los Angeles have made it extremely difficult for the private agencies, minority groups, and the poor to join in the war. Despite these difficulties, we have already sent 17 million to Los Angeles so that no poor person would be deprived of an available opportunity. But in his effort to keep the blame in Yorty's court, not in his, Shriver stated the facts of life rather succinctly. We sent the director of all community action programs to Los Angeles 5 days ago. He has been meeting with city officials and with representatives of the groups who've previously been excluded from the local anti-poverty efforts. We hope he will be successful, but the final responsibility rests not with us, but with the citizens and the leadership of Los Angeles, end quote. In that abdication, Shriver openly surrendered to City Hall control. Thus, the poor, weak, and colored were again left to mercies of the rich, strong, and white. The Office of Economic Opportunity, the agency established as partisan for the poor, had declared itself neutral. Actually, OEA's white flag started unfurling rather early in the war. Shriver began preparing the senior staff for his denante shortly after the 89th Congress returned from its 1965 spring recess. Even while they were in recess, some congressmen had written or called Shriver about the ill efforts OEO was having on their political fortunes. One congressman laid it to me pretty straight, Shriver said with an unfunny laugh. He said, Shriver, as you know, I voted for your bill, and I agreed with your talk about giving the poor a better break by helping them fight the system. But Shriver, I just came back from home, and I must tell you that I found out that back home, that when the poor people talk about fighting the system, they're talking about fighting me. I don't need to tell you, Shriver, that it's nothing personal, but under these circumstances, I can't support you anymore, end quote. It got some laughs, but the story was true, and the punch of it was not lost on most members of the senior staff. And that's what we're going to have to start thinking, Shriver said, ended the meeting, and whatever there might have been of the OEO's fight for the poor, the direct approaches of Mayor Daley, the subtler tactics of Mayor Yorty, and the politically hazardous confrontation with Governor Wallace had each proved effective in controlling Washington-based efforts to aid the Black poor. Together, they imposed an inescapable conclusion. The political bureaucratic battle on behalf of the Black poor was indeed a losing battle. The year was 1965. Is a logical time to mark the downturn of pacification, a brief civil rights boom that began moving toward a peak just 5 years earlier. After one full year, many Blacks began to discover, or at least suspect, that so-called war against poverty was equally a war against the poor. By then, they were right. The Great Society pacification had failed. Wow. That's the end of chapter 2. That's the end of chapter 2. And this is the beginning of part 2, where it says war, racism, rice, and seniority. War, racism, rice, and seniority. I'm going to try to read a little bit more of this, and then we'll probably stop and then get started again at another time. But I hope you guys are enjoying this. And I apologize for getting emotional there earlier. I couldn't help it. I was like, I cannot believe this is happening. I was saying it to myself, but I got emotional just thinking about our people. My people, in particular, my family lives in Alabama. And as I mentioned, I grew up in Selma, actually, Lloyd, right outside of Selma, which is in the county seat of Dallas County, Alabama. And it is a part of the Black Belt. There's about 5 or 6 counties down in the middle part of Alabama that's called the Black Belt because all of those counties are majority Black, and where the marches and everything was taking place is where my family lived. And to think about having to send all those troops and FBI agents to protect our people from state troopers and police officers just filled me with emotion. So I apologize. The war and racism have common roots and objectives. Both began in hate, fear, and suspicion, and both have as their objective a permanent advantage and domination of one's group or ideology over the other. The victor writes the history of the war and makes what he hopes will be the rules for all future endeavors. Basic to racial exploitation and war are both need and greed. Ooh, that's good. Basic to racial exploitation and war are both need and greed. Natural law and social contract theorists such as Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau contended that when man emerged from his primeval and natural state, he agreed to enter a social contract with other men, giving up his individual absolute freedom both for group protection and to satisfy such other basic needs as food and shelter. Geography, however, played some part in the alliances formed by societal man, and a common geography seems to have influenced physical and other characteristics which amount to race. Consequently, alliances tend to follow racial or tribal lines. More modern political theorists, such as the late American Black intellectual W.E.B. Du Bois, contended the war between races is a dominant theme of the 20th century. Most certainly, race seems to have been a strong factor in tactical decisions made by the United States in its wars of this century, but the racial factor has counted even more heavily in the country's domestic wars than in international wars. Actually, as John Locke pointed out, America, certainly since bringing slaves to these shores in 1619, has been in a perpetual state of war. I hope you all are enjoying this. Consider liking and sharing the video. 2 things, psychic capability and grievance based on vested interests seem minimal requirements for an aggressor to initiate war or for a defender to sustain his defense. Men identify with others who look like them, a natural inclination since selfishness seems basic in man's nature. As Hobbes would continue, the selfish part of a man's nature make it impossible for him to take the life of another man, with 2 exceptions. Number 1, mental derangement, at least temporarily, tantamount to a compatible for suicide, or 2, a psychic conditioning that dehumanizes, removes the natural self-identity from the projected victim. That's very interesting. Wow. For the purpose of traditional war, the first exception becomes moot, at least with respect to the process and tactics. But the second exception, psychic conditioning that dehumanizes one victim, relies heavily on racial contradistinctions. The aggressor must be able to see the victim as unlike himself. This explains why during World War II, billboards along U.S. highways and in the cities carried large pictures depicting leaders of the Axis powers, hence their followers too. As other forms of animal life, Adolf Hitler, leader of German Nazis, for example, was depicted as a rat. Japanese Emperor Hirohito was depicted as a snake, and Italy's Benito Mussolini was shown to be a fascist pig. Once these contradistinctions from ourselves were accepted, however tentatively, the rest was easy. We were then prepared psychologically to wage war without mercy, almost. Then there were racial exceptions based on degrees of contradistinctions. Thus, the atomic bombs hit the Japanese twice, but never the Germans or Italians. Wow, I never thought about that historically in that fashion. Interesting. Also, US citizens placed in concentration camps were of Japanese ancestry, but they never placed the German or Italians in concentration camps. Racial contradistinctions, greatly simplified and magnified by stark racial differences, accompany descendants of Africans enslaved in America, but they were not taken for granted. Slave traders and slave masters were severest efforts for the outset, magnified and cemented every possible distinction. Language was both a crucial psychological and tactical factor. At penalty of death, slaves were neither permitted to speak their own language nor to master the language of their captors. Thus, gluttonous sharks followed slave ships from the west coast of Africa all the way to Virginia, stuffing their gills with the black carcasses thrown overboard. The tongues of these black cargo must have become a shark's delicacy, because when it either was not logistically feasible to separate slaves speaking the same language, or was too expensive to throw them overboard to ensure their mutinous with one another, their tongues were frequently cut from their throats and pitched over the side. Sick. Early slaveholders justified slavery on grounds that slaves were, after all, heathens. That is, neither did they have a good command of English, nor were they members of the Christian faith. In time, of course, these contradistinguished ameliorated to some degree, though not completely. The failure to command sophisticated grammar still denies federal assistance to the Black poor who cannot handle the paperwork. And Muhammad Ali's adoption of the pacifistic Muslim religion and renunciation of his Christian name, Cassius Marcellus Clay, were adequate to deny him further draft deferments and strip him of his crown as heavyweight boxing champion of the world. Color still remains the distinction upon which Blacks are denied housing, jobs, proper schooling, loans, protection of the laws, food assistance, and virtually every other necessity of survival. It's 2021 and it's still like that. The slave master's greed for rapidly produced slaves and his rationalization of it forced the Black male into the role of super stud and the Black woman into the image of immorality. The lingering legends of the Black super stud are still mercilessly haunting the insecurities of many white males, prompting further rationalizations and contradistinctions. A reasonable question is raised by this discussion. Who profits from all of this? Why perpetuate wars against innocent people? A facile but true response: colonial domination of Black colonies or ghettos at home and neo-colonialism abroad. Highly significant is the fact that both the domestic and Asian wars are being waged without benefit of constitutional sanction. It is equally noteworthy, as discussed further in Chapter 6, that both the undeclared Korean conflict beginning in 1950 and the undeclared Vietnam War escalating into a national issue during the mid and late 1960s were accompanied by new repressive laws and threats of concentration camps to keep in check the legitimate concerns of citizens being robbed of their freedom to choose or reject war. In the advent of both of these undeclared wars, there was also a market drive of Black Americans to secure citizenship rights and socioeconomic advancement. In other words, during those periods, Blacks have attempted to end the colonial existence of ghetto life, freeing themselves from economic and cultural exploitation. When such liberation movements are attempted abroad, they are usually labeled communist threats, as they are here at home. But there is less reluctance to say that a war is being fought abroad to put down the unrest. In either case, however, the perpetuation of those wars can proceed with popular support only when an adequate job of psychic conditioning has taken place. In modern America, propagandists for domestic and foreign wars tend to tie racial contradictions rather neatly into the vested interests of the dominant group, carefully labeling any and all attempts of the defender to survive and progress as threats to society and manifestations of racially inferior characteristics. A rationalization for U.S. involvement in Vietnam, therefore, would be that the indolence, backwardness, and venality, the failure of the South Vietnamese people to understand and appreciate freedom and their unwillingness to fight for it require U.S. involvement. And secondly, their failure to secure their freedom threatens for the freedom and national interests of America. The rationalization of the U.S., that's crazy, nuts. By the same logic, the explanation for the war against Blacks here at home is that the Negro slave legacy, alleged low IQ, hence poor education, immorality, and criminality, proclivity for drugs, rape, robbery, and murder, account for the need for new laws and military tactics put down insurrection. Here, the vested interests are made ostensibly parallel to the public interest and maintaining law and order, reducing crime, and protecting the nation from internal enemies. Thus, the psychic and vested interest factors are made clear to domestic population majority, and the manipulation of their will is achieved in order to wage race wars at home and abroad. Wow. This chapter right here is getting ready to be serious, y'all. Chapter 3, the psychic preparation. And the reason why I say this is because clearly this stuff is still very relevant. This is chapter 3 that I'm about to start. I hope you all can see it, the psychic preparation. And I'm probably not gonna be able to get through this whole channel because I actually need to get up and do some other things here. But I'm gonna continue to read through this and you all can continue to rock with me. But I'm going to read the first couple of pages just so you can get a feel of what chapter 3 is about. But the psychic preparation is if for people who have not read this book and just coming in, I'm reading The Choice, the issue of Black survival. It's going to make a lot of sense to you. It's going to help you connect a lot of dots. It's going to make a lot of sense. All right, chapter 3, the psychic preparation. 3 doctrines were particularly instrumental during the 1960s in psychologically preparing Americans to mount a domestic pacification program, then escalate that pacification into a guiltless, exterminative war among ourselves. Come on. Puritanism, a super moralism, is perhaps the strongest psychoethic in America. It claims moral virtue as a basis for all its acts, whatever their nature or consequences. It is as American as the Pilgrims. Moynihanism is a doctrine of fault psychology. It documents, he's put documents in quote, he put fault in quote. It documents the basic faults and inferiorities of those being or about to be exploited. It is an old doctrine under new management. Shriverism is essentially a good business ethic. Like Puritanism, it too is old and as American as the Boston Tea Party. As practiced in the OEO, money going to big business and visibility going to the poor, Shriverism justifies free enterprise even in the purest pursuit of crucial social objectives. It offers the poor and defeated a chance to compete with the rich and triumphant on an equal basis, making sure that the poor do not take unfair advantage of the rich. Puritanism was epitomized by John Calvin, a European moralist who thought it better to cut off a man's head than permit personal immorality or religious disagreement. But there were other aspects of Puritanism or Calvinism which were well suited to the needs of the colonial settlers in America. It required a rigid spiritual and physical regimen, demanded piety and hard work, and implied that while some men were born to die sinners, there were some correlation between the one's regimen and his socioeconomic prosperity. The colonialists found this useful, for indeed they had to work hard and scheme well to preserve against the hardships they faced, and not least which we're talking about, taking from the Indian, actually the original American, his hospitality, then his land, and eventually his existence as a people. The Indian was obsolete as soon as the colonialist had survived a winter. Similarly, the strong back and rugged constitution of Black men were absolutely crucial to the white man's venture of mining wealth from the Indian's land. Impiety of deed did not erase the ponderous verbal piety of early America. Toil, a cardinal principle of Calvinism as practiced in America, was applied stringently to Blacks brought here from Africa, but the concomitant rewards were denied at all costs, with the enforced understanding that the Black man's toil was legitimately performed solely for the white man's benefit, a convenience explainably under Calvinism philosophy of fate. Obviously, the logic breaks down here. Puritanism is a false ethic, but it does help explain how colonists could fight a war for their independence soon after their arrival while holding other men as slaves, and continue to deny the right of independence to the same group 2 centuries later. With an overwhelming sense of virtue, many white Americans can rationalize this, and the OEA-related schemes of the 1960s require some modern interpretations of the basic Calvinist theme. First, it was necessary for Americans themselves, especially the Black poor, to understand and accept their fault, that their failure to prosper under the system was due to some innate flaw, but a flaw which was being corrected via compensatory measures such as special laws, programs, and other benevolences that the white guardians of morality and justice thoughtfully instituted. Hence, a massive civil rights program and a war on poverty, both federally sponsored, of course. This is the standard Moynihan Doctrine. Secondly, the usual presumption of the capitalist would have to be ensured, mainly that they would profit economically from whatever modifications occurred philosophically or otherwise. Crucial also was the clear understanding by all that such profits and such arrangements as would guarantee them were absolutely essential to correcting the basic flaws attributed to the Black poor. The cures could not come except by way of profits, hence involvement of the private sector in the implementation of new social legislation and programs, classic Shriverism. Some might call this republicanism of the Nixon variety, but it is characterized as Shriverism here because during the decisive decade, this doctrine was most effectively espoused and implemented by businessman Shriver, a well-known Democrat. Them old Democrats again, where we think our saviors, that we love running out talking about we done won because we done voted for them. Moynihan was the establishment's chief broker for selling the thought psychology in the post-1960 era. It was the Negro family, commonly known as the Moynihan Report, which in 1965 documented the flabbiness of the Black family fabric and provided the rationale for the Great Society's rescue of the Black poor via education and training route. A second brokerage was needed, however, to sell the cures that would come from the mandatory involvement of the public sector. The chief benefactors would be fairly matured military industrial complex and the educational industrial complex spawned and nourished by new technocratic educational experiments and the conglomerate giants who, for a price, could be persuaded to assist their government in coming to the aid of society's downtrodden misfits. The chief brokerage house, ironically, became the OEA's establishment, which enthusiastically handed out lucrative Job Corps contracts under them, must neither be permitted nor trained to compete with established white unionists and other privileged groups in society. Thus, Moynihan and Shriverism came to represent two interdependent sales lines for neo-Calvinism, a form of racism in the technocratic society, and capitalism, a system whose foremost concern are capital and business, money with people running second, however close. Economist Moynihan prepared his report with White House sanction while he was Assistant Secretary of Labor during the early days of the OEO. It was to have been the basis for the 1966 White House Conference to secure these rights, a forum for the Great Society pacifications. Until Black intellectuals were joined by some of the white colleagues in condemning the report as benign racism, it was at least that. The central point of fault he lays to the Negro as a group then presses home his indictment of the Black family. Quote, at the heart of the deterioration of the fabric of Negro society is the deterioration of the Negro family, end quote. Some might argue that this is a basic truth because it is true of a society in general, but Moynihan was not writing about society in general. Through introspection might have served better to uncover the real faults that this ostensibly objective investigation of the society's imitators and victims, but to prove his allegation of Black thought, Moynihan conjured up old sex theories and cites illegitimate birth rates to demonstrate the weakness in the fabric of the Black family structure. In doing so, he gives no attention to the fact that the pseudo-piety of early American Calvinism shredded Black family structure by the systemic rape, kidnap, and forced division of Black families during slavery and subsequently. One facet of Moynihanism is to make any gains by the oppressed group appear to be magnanimity on the part of the oppressor. This is true regardless of how difficult the oppressor had made those gains. For example, in the central assertion of this chapter, The Negro American Revolution, Moynihan wrote, quote, the award of the Nobel Peace Prize to Dr. Martin Luther King was as much an expression of the hope for the future as it was recognition for past achievement. Such phrasing belies the fact that the honor came to Dr. King because he fought against the oppressive forces in the society whom Moynihan implies were benefactors. It more than ignores the fact that Dr. King won the award because he opposed the slaughter in Indochina and the conspiracies that perpetuate Black colonization at home. After his insinuation that the federal government was in some way supporting Dr. King and the civil rights movement, Moynihan transfers the full weight of the movement onto the shoulders of the Johnson administration. Quote, it is no less clear that carrying this Negro revolution forward to a successful conclusion is a first priority confronting the Great Society, end quote. Pacification, yes. Revolution, no. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did little or nothing at all to break down the barriers at labor union halls that kept Black men from getting a day's work and a day's fair pay. Nor did the Office of Economic Opportunity do anything materially to change the peonage of the mass of non-whites into resource with economic visibility of its own. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 did help add 800,000 Black voters to the rolls in the South in time for the 1968 elections. But beyond that gesture, at least 100 years later and incomplete, the Great Society pacifications failed on a grand scale. An establishment rationale for these failures hang together only if people have been prepared to accept them through the dynamics of fault psychology, vested interest payoffs, and the successful dehumanization of exploited groups. These have been principal roles of neo-Calvinism, Shriverism, and Moynihanism. They are the essential philosophies which prepare a nation for guiltless war at home and abroad, all in the name of purity, good business, and altruism. Thus, when Moynihan wrote his, quote, Negro lower class memorandum to President Nixon, dated January 3rd, 1969, shortly before the 1969 presidential inauguration, Moynihan was simply extending his public disservice of dehumanizing the Black poor, paving the way for whatever, quote, special treatment, end quote, seemed indicated in the decade of the 1970s. But the particularity of the treatment indicated was not left entirely for the president or others who would, likely by design, eventually read Moynihan's memos. The treatment was broadly prescribed in the description of the illness. First, in January 3rd, 1969, the memo, Moynihan reminds President Nixon that his election was a mandate to deal with the disruptions caused by the new Black demands for justice. Quote, it is said that freedom lives in the intricacies of authority. When the structure collapses, freedom disappears and society is governed by relationships based on power. Increasing numbers of Americans seem of late to have sensed this and to have become actively concerned about the drift of events. Your election was, in a sense, the first major consequence of that mounting concern. Your administration represents the first significant opportunity to change the direction in which events move. Your ask, then, is clear: to restore the authority of American institutions, not certainly under that name, but with a clear sense that what is at issue is the continued acceptance by the great mass of people of the legitimacy and efficacy of the present arrangements of American society and of our processes for changing those arrangements. Next, Moynihan clearly labels those he once identified as the source of the disruption, albeit with a gracious acknowledgement of the, quote, the true horror of the situation white America had forced onto Black America and the deep disabilities that came about in consequence, end quote. To him, and the current threat to the society comes from the disabilities, quote, of Black people, the reasons of which being of minor immediate importance. Then comes careful labeling along with passing dismal of the causes. And this will be the last thing I'll read tonight. Quote, the problem is not that one group in the population is the beginning to react to centuries of barbarism by another group. The problem is that this cultural reaction among Black militants is accompanied by the existence of a large, disorganized urban lower class, which, like such groups everywhere, is unable and essentially violent. Wow. Unstable and essentially violent, end quote. So that takes us to page 86. We started off with page 52. When I start back, probably next week, we will start off with page 86. We are on chapter 3, and chapter 3 is talking about the psychic preparation. Thank you all for listening today. I'm glad that you all joined me, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.